Well, hello everyone. Well, we have a very busy episode. We're going to paint and even repaint some figures, and we're going to build a base for our Panzer II. Lot to do, let's get moving. Painting scale model figures, well, that's always been a challenge for me, and it continues to be a challenge. However, because I also enjoy making dioramas and small vignettes, I understand the importance of figures to tell the story. While not great at painting figures, it's something I continue to work at and hopefully over time will improve. That's all probably a very long way of making a disclaimer to say, well, I'm not a figure painter. Take this little bit of a tutorial for what it's worth, just watching me struggle through the process. The figures I'm using for this project are from Alpine, and they represent two little guys, two tankers from the 3rd Armored Division, while, of course, my figures need to be from the Ranger unit. The only conversion I needed to do on these figures was to scrape off their shoulder emblems of the 3rd Armored and then paint on some Ranger symbols. I prepare my palette with some Generation 3 acrylic paints. The colors range from very dark to very bright on the palette. And that might be an issue later on. We'll see. You know, one of the facts of my struggles with figure painting is that I just don't do enough of them to get into any sort of a practiced routine. So every time I do figures, feels like it's the first time. And at the same time, I'm always trying to watch other people's works and learn from them. And so my technique changes from time to time too. So I don't have a real set rhythm. Now, I'm sure that is part of my issue with why I'm not a very good figure painter. I just need more practice and I need to settle on something that works for me. With these figures, I'm using a method where I lay down a very dark base color, in this case it's a black-red, and then I'm going to be adding highlights just to subsequently lighten all the different facial features. Now, this approach to figure painting is nothing new. I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of adding a dark base color and just progressively getting lighter and lighter highlights in smaller and smaller areas on the face. With the first few layers of highlights added, I'm actually kind of happy with the results. The face is starting to come together. It's got a little bit of personality, a little bit of life to it. And so, so far so good. But let's see what happens. So let's just chalk this up to, again, my lack of experience and lack of expertise in painting figures. But on these guys, I felt like I'm getting to maybe, 75% through on these figures. But I just am struggling to grab that last little bit, the part that refines the figures and makes them look, well, like figures are supposed to look. In particular, I'm really struggle with the blending part. So I can add the highlights onto the cheeks and the nose, and I have the deep shadows already, but it's blending between those extremes that I'm having difficulties with. And I realize that part of it is just because I'm not taking care of my palette correctly, and part of it is just my lack of skill. But in the end, I became really frustrated with these figures, and I decided I wanted to try them one more time. And now we start with round 2. Rather than a dark base color, I've decided to start with a mid-tone base color, a light sand. And once that has dried, I give both figures just a light wash of that darker red-black color, just to allow some of the definition into the shadow areas to be evident. My thinking and my hope by changing the base color to a mid-tone rather than the dark is that I will have an easier time blending the transitions. The process from this point forward is basically the same. I'm adding highlights to the upper areas, tops of the cheeks, bridge of the nose, tops of the lips, top of the chin, and adding subsequently brighter tones for the extreme highlights in smaller and smaller areas. Even at this early stage, I can tell that this process is working a little bit better for me. It's like I'm that kid you just go ahead and give the 8-color crayon box to. I don't know what to do with the 64 colors. And it's similar here. Using that mid-tone base to start with, well, it just simplified the process for me. And then once I have the highlights in place, then I'm able to come back in and add a little bit of shadowing here and there, just to bring a little bit of depth and added contrast to the figure. Well, now that I feel a little bit better about this and I've got things in hand, I just continue working my figures, adding again the highlights to the upper areas of the cheeks and chin and nose and such. And then at the same time, after that's complete, go ahead and darken my base tones a little bit and start adding a little bit of shadows. And that would be like under the upper lip, below the chin, and on the cheeks, just to give them a little bit of a hollow appearance. And then finally the last step that kind of unified everything and brought everything into focus was to add just once again a very, very light dark colored wash overall, and that just unified the entire appearance. So after struggling with those heads for the better part of a day, let's move on to painting up the uniforms. A lot of the colors for the uniforms are going to come from this U.S. Army World War II uniform set, which is really handy to have all those colors. And what's even better is at the back of the box, they show me how to paint. So with that, there's no way I can go wrong now. This is going to be a breeze. And once again, I set up my palette, but this time with the uniform colors. Often I'll use the airbrush when painting my figures, and you've seen this from other folks as well, where you shoot the figure perhaps with a black color, and then from straight up above with a light color to give it that zenithal light, so it really emphasizes where the light is coming from and the shadows and the highlights. Something I do, but something I didn't do this time, and it's probably just because I just was, well, I'm ready to move on and get these figures done, and so I just start painting. In a similar approach as with the faces, I just started with a mid-tone and began adding subsequent highlight colors to all the folds. Again, keeping in mind where the light is coming from above, and then came back in with a little bit of the shadow color just to deepen some of those folds and crevices and creases. And as a final step, and this is really important, it's one of the things I'm learning, and it takes a delicate hand, at least my hand needs to be more delicate, is to outline a lot of the surface features around the belts and straps and zippers and things like that. That really adds to the contrasts and makes it pop. Okay, I think it's about time to set those figures aside for a little while and start working on something that's a little bit more in my comfort zone, and that would be a base. I've mentioned in some of my prior videos that I like to use a board as my foundation and then apply carving foam over the top. Well, speaking of those figures, here they are, making an appearance on the base. And I'll just use these to make a real quick outline of just a little bit of elevation change, just to give the base a little bit more personality and visual interest. And then the next step is simply to use a sharp knife and just carve out a little bit of the foam away, and then I'm adding a little bit of elevation to the backside, just to add a little bit of visual interest to this otherwise very flat, barren desert scene. Carve a few ruts, little road ruts, where the tank would have passed or other vehicles might have passed. Now, once I'm happy with the blue foam and I've got the elevations carved into it and I've got the different surface features in place, it's time to go ahead and add the texture to the scene. When it comes time to adding the texture, the surface texture to your bases, I think that's when the type of material that you use is really kind of dependent or dictated by the type of terrain that you're trying to create. Well, of course, here, I'm going to rely on those reference photographs to kind of dictate what type of an appearance this base will have. And what I observed in those photographs was a terrain that was predominantly rocky and dusty and arid and dry. So I think I'll be able to capture some of this effect using these acrylic pastes in multiple layers. So the first layer was a rough terrains, and so that particular paste has quite a bit of sand and grit to it. So once it's dry, I've got a really nice foundation, almost like small pebbles across the scene. And now this is followed by a second layer of paste, but this paste is much finer in texture than the first layer, so it really helps promote that idea of blown sand and dirt deposits. And adding a little bit of water just to help thin it out, just to make sure that you're not covering up the first layer, but just allowing this to flow around the first layer. So we want the texture of the base layer and the secondary texture to both be prominent. And of course, where would we all be without our hair dryers, right guys? And before I get too much further along here, I wanted to go ahead and get this base looking kind of sharp, and so I just added some nice edges here with some balsa wood. And of course, one of the more important elements that should not be forgotten on any diorama or vignette is to make sure that your vehicle is integrated within the scene and not floating over the top of the scene. And for that, I like to use two-part magic sculpt and just sculpt little bits of that alongside or underneath the tracks just to make sure that everything's in contact with the ground. And then a final layer of acrylic paste is added overall, and this is the finest of all the textures, so this is really a wind-blown sand or dust. And I'm using this very sparingly, and it's heavily thinned with water, so I'm actually allowing it just to kind of flow over the surface and be captured in all those deeper recesses, just as wind-blown sand and dirt might do. And then, of course, I need some stones and rocks to be cast about. And so for that, I've got a little bit of plaster. Right now, I'm just mixing it up into a little Tupperware cup, and I'll allow that to set up for a few hours, and then just break it open. Now I have all sorts of little nice textures to sprinkle about the scene. So combine this plaster with a few little pebbles that I found outside in the garden, and we're pretty much good to go. And we'll get ready on these final steps. So the plaster and these little stones, I just add to the top of the base here, adding with a little bit of white glue just to set them in place. And then once this white glue has dried, I just come back in with a little bit of that sandy texture and just apply a little bit around the edges of some of these stones and over the top of things just to make sure everything is nice and integrated. And let's see how this looks. A little bit quick test fit. Everything seems to be riding like it should. We're good to go. So of course, all those different acrylic textured pastes had different colors, so I need to unify the space into one desert color. And for that, I'm actually mixed up a little bit of the same color that I used as the desert camouflage on the vehicle itself. And that should really help unify everything together and make sure that everything looks like it's part of the same scene. And once the base colors are on, then it's just a matter of picking out and highlighting some of the details. I actually like this step a lot, which is just picking out different rocks and different surface elements with a little bit of acrylic paint, just to get a little bit of contrast and visual interest to the scene. With the rocks painted, it's time to add a little bit of contrast and shadows to the surface itself. So again, I'm turning back to oil paints. This is sepia tone that I'm just using around the rocks just to give a little bit of shadow and definition and help with the contrast. Using the same colors on your groundwork as you have as you weathered your vehicle is so very important. I'm using the same colors of oil paints that I used to create the dust tones and the oils to go ahead and add dust tones to the base. So everything is going to be nice and integrated using the same colors throughout. Okay, so we're getting down to the finish here. One of the final steps is to add pigments to the base, and for this I'm using exactly the same pigment colors that I used on the model when I weathered the model, and I'm applying them the same way as I applied them onto the model, and that being they're dissolved into the odorless thinner. And I'm kind of concentrating these pigments into areas of recesses and areas where I'd like higher accumulations of dust and dirt. So we're basically at the end of this project. The final step here is to reestablish a little bit of that contrast and shadows that might have been lost when we added the pigments and some of those lighter color oil effects. So just a few dabs around some of the rocks and some of the other surface features helps to bring that back. This has been a fun project. I hope you've enjoyed this. The little Panzer II was captured by the U.S. Rangers in Tunisia, 1943, and the history lessons that went along with it. If you haven't done so already, please hit that like and subscribe button. It does help the channel get out to more folks. I will also let you know that I do have a Patreon page. The link for that is below. Now, I do have a new project that's going to be coming up in the next episodes, and the folks on my Patreon already know what it is. And of course, if you join Patreon, you could also enjoy some longer form videos where we go a little bit more in depth on some of these techniques. The message board is always open for chatting, and high resolution photographs of all these models and the progress shots are also available. So until then, and the next project, happy modeling, and we'll see you soon. Take care.